Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Adam is right. I was burdening him with my emails and my lamentations for the same amount of time I took to get here from Oxford. I could have flown to Islamabad. And so make of that what you will. So anyway, I'm just going to kind of rattle through, and I turned up late to Catherine's talk, so my apologies. I did manage to get Sabrina's talk, Patrick's talk, and it's actually really good because I can sort of marry all of those, I think, hopefully together. Without further ado, these are just sort of some of the figures that we're sort of up against when we kind of consider. You look at that. So these are sort of some of the issues that we have to consider, not just in terms of human deaths, but also in terms of the financial burden that AMR poses. And on my final set of slides, I'll come back and we can talk about a different type of arms race. Oh, gosh, that's still there. Why is that still there? Okay, so one of the things that we often do, correctly or incorrectly, is compare AMR to COVID. And if you kind of think about how many people have have died of COVID, and I've got my data from a Worldometer, rightly or wrongly, but actually it kind of comes in at about 7 million, and we're pretty much facing that number of deaths due to AMR year in, year out. But then if you kind of think about actually who was affected by COVID, it was the elderly, the people had comorbidities, things like diabetes, hypertension, etc. Yet with AMR, the people that have been most affected are the very young, and women are disproportionately affected because of AMR, childbirth, menstruation, UTIs, etc. And that is a subject that is not fully explored, and it should be. How much will it cost? Well, you can have a look at the figures there. AMR is just going to actually squash us in terms of how much money we've committed to, have to commit to fighting AMR compared with what we've done with COVID. Which countries are most affected? And Patrick made this point. With AMR, it will be low-income countries. The burden, the financial burden, will have to be picked up by high-income countries, whether we like it or not. Can it be fixed by a simple vaccine? No, it's extremely complicated. And can diagnosis be sort of quickly done? And the answer to that is also regrettably no, and I'll come back and talk about that later. When we sort of talk about AMR, we talk about the economics of AMR, we talk about the One Health of AMR, but actually fundamentally AMR is about the bug becoming resistant to the antibiotic. It's not humans, it's not society, it's actually the microorganism. And they're actually very, very clever at doing that. A lot of people, they're not clever. Actually, bacteria are pretty stupid, but they're like sponges, and they just absorb DNA, and they're very good at rearranging it. And so this kind of brings me on to my next slide. And the center of the problem is actually with these things called ARGs. And the problem with microbiology, like so many subjects, is just full of jargons, and actually AMR is not a particularly helpful acronym either. If you get stuck in a queue in the post office and you get really bored because it takes forever, always, a bit like a train journey to Liverpool, and you just say to them, what do you do? Oh, I'm a mechanic. And cool. And they go, what do you do? And you think, that's a good subject. What do I do? And then you try and explain to them what AMR means. But fundamentally, AMR starts with ARG, the antimicrobial resistance gene. And around all of these ARGs, you've got all these kind of what we call jumping genes or mobile genetic elements that are able to mobilize DNA. Sometimes those bits of DNA are actually very, very large, 40, 50 kilobases, particularly these things called ISCRs. And around that, as Patrick mentioned when he talked about CTX715 and so on, it could be on the chromosome, could be on the plasmid, and the plasmids are like these, if you like, these space shuttles that actually go from one bacteria to another. And I'll talk a bit more about that in my next couple of slides. And of course, the plasmids are associated with compatibility and these things called TATs, toxin antitoxin systems, which we simply don't really understand a lot about them. And of course, then we spoke about the One Health, and Catherine's project was about One Health in the community with antibiotic usage and AMR. And One Health is important with bugs like E. coli, is as important with bugs like Klebsiella, who knows. So anyway, if we're going to look at how plasmids transfer from one bug to another, essentially what we do is this chappy here on the left-hand side is the donor, and this one here is the recipient. And, we basically put them together in the lab on a plate. We turn the lights down low, we play some Mozart, and then about an hour later we come back and we see what's happened. And essentially this is a very effective system by bacteria, because they will transfer DNA easily within about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. They're very, very good at doing that. But the problem is that this is a culture-based system. And if I took all the bugs from your gut or took the bugs out in the field, there's 70% of the bacteria we cannot grow. So we're very limited in how we actually analyze this. So a couple of years ago, a very talented PhD student, Chua Yang, and myself, we kind of thought up this system. Can we use a non-culturable method to do that? And this is what we did, and it's quite complex, but I'll just quickly run you through it. It's essentially what we did was to label the chromosome of the donor and then the plasmid, and then we basically let it loose in soil samples, in water samples. We've let it loose in gut, not my gut, but chicken gut and other things. And we're able to basically use a FACS system. And now we've got to the point in technology where we can pick out individual labeled or fluorescing bacteria and sequence the genome. So we're able to use these technologies now to try and address real-world problems. And what we found was actually our understanding of where resistance go before was like this, and our understanding now is something like this. It blew our minds. It really, really did. And as an example of that, we found that one plasmid, which is nearly always only associated with Enterobacteriaceae, like E. coli, bugs like that, actually went into Enterococcus, gram-positive, and then we can actually mate it back again. And to cross the gram-positive, negative barrier was just something that we just thought was sci-fi, but we think this happens now all the time. Our understanding of plasmid biology is actually very weak. So thinking about One Health, one of the things that we've done is to apply this model now. The great thing about having a model like this, and there are other models out there like fish, labeling, but we can now actually look at microplastics. And when we've looked at microplastics, we found that the presence of microplasmids increased conjugation up to 1,000-fold. And we've looked at different sizes of microplastics, different types of microplastics. And what the microplastics do is to basically switch on an SOS response in the bacteria where they go slightly crazy and they will receive or exchange DNA. So we spoke about One Health, and one of the speakers spoke about mosquitoes. And so one of the studies that we did a few years ago was actually go to northern Pakistan. And I had this idea way back when I was in Karachi in an NICU, and I just saw a fly go from one baby to another, to another, to another. And I just thought, well, that's madness. And so we then did a study in northern Pakistan, in Peshawar. This was done at the AKTH hospital there. And we essentially we cleaned all the 4 wards, 2 female, 2 male, 1 winter, 1 summer. And then we collected all the flies, all the insects, in fact, on those wards, including mosquitoes and spiders. And we found actually that the bacteria were, first of all, is that you can see the resistant rates here. These are Patrick's subject was ESBLs. All of these bacteria here that we got from the flies and the cockroaches. So it's flies in the summer, cockroaches in the winter. Sounds a bit horrible, but that's what happened. And you can see the levels of resistance from whether it was from the insect or from the clinical sample. And then, just like Patrick has done, we've actually then done SNP analysis, and we've actually showed, in fact, that it's the same bacteria kicking around in a hospital that are picked up by flies or cockroaches and then will superinfect post-surgical sites. So we're actually now doing a much broader study around about 70 countries, going into hospitals and collecting the flies and comparing that to AMR data. But if we kind of done some really crude modelling, and you can criticise me for this, and rightly so, from the data that we've got from Peshawar, and we also apply climate change and looking at insect population with climate change, something like 50,000 trillion flies will carry carbapenem-resistant bacteria. Now, supposing we are wrong and we're out by a factor of 100, that's still 500 trillion flies. Let's supposing we're bonkersly wrong and we're out by a factor of 1,000. We're still in trouble, so flies as vectors, and this is carbapenem-resistant here. This isn't ampicillin or anything. This is really quite worrying. The other problem is that we use antibiotics in farming. And the question is, going back to the One Health thing about the spillage into human populations, is it relevant? And I'm still sort of struggling with that question. But unquestionably, we eat or consume a lot of meat. Every single minute of every single day on planet Earth, 150,000 chickens are slaughtered. You think, well, that's bad news, but actually chickens are much better in terms of greenhouse emissions than, for example, lamb and beef, etc. And in fact, actually shellfish and fish. So in fact, if you want to do the planet a favour and you're a meat eater, chickens are really good, and also for faith-based reasons as well. But the sales of this, and we've just had the UN meeting in New York where there was a big, questions were asked about, we've got to reduce the consumption of antibiotics in animals, and you could argue, well, that's a common sense thing and that's a good thing. But there's just two problems with that. Number one is it's an industry that is only going to go in one direction. At the moment, it's probably worth in the order of about $8-9 billion US. Well, good luck reining that back, because that's an economic question. But also the fact, if you start taking, for example, and we've had three speakers speak about, four speakers speak about work in Africa. Sorry, it's been a long morning for me. You will induce poverty in Africa because these farmers need it. So it's all very well to have these sort of lofty notions from the UN, etc., that we've got to do X, Y, and Z. But one thing we cannot do is to actually induce poverty in these countries. So it's a huge issue. However, if you kind of then and look at one antibiotic which we've looked at, and we're looking at others, and this is just colistin, you'll see that actually colistin is produced by countries like China, also India, I might add to. We haven't got there on there, but Vietnam. And actually, it's then kind of has European subsidiary or companies that will then import that and then dump that onto low-income countries. And so everybody has their part to play in this. I could speak for a week about this, but I won't bore you with details. And those people, fine people at the bottom are PhD students and research fellows that undertook this rather incredible analysis, including looking through every single shipment document that we managed to get our hands on. So the previous speakers have already spoken about this, so I'm not going to really dwell on it too much. AMR is an issue, and it's, as usual, it's low-income countries that will bear the burden of this. I just kind of wanted to show you this, and this is now the WHO sort of drug priority list, and it's here on the right-hand side, this one down here, and roughly 8 out of the 9 top ones are gram-negative bacteria, and it's always gram-negative bacteria that's going to, really, really be the issue here. This is data from the latest gram study that looked at predictions as to what was going to happen in 2050. This is data, actually very recent data, and you can see now we've got a sort of an increase in AMR in terms of burden with the older population. That's largely because we're all living longer, we're getting more and more infirm, and we all need more antibiotics, but nonetheless, I'm not entirely convinced. I'll pick Catherine's brains at the end of this. She's shaking her head. For example, I think the burden in neonates is actually, and the mortality in neonates is, from the countries where I work, is much higher. How bad is it going to get? Well, I mentioned these little plasmids, these little sort of bits of DNA, and sometimes these bits of DNA now will confer resistance to colistin, to tetracycline, and to all carbapenems. And so we've just kind of found some of those plasmids actually in South Pakistan, so and also Southeast Asia. So it's a real nightmare. The bacteria are very, very good at adjusting themselves. Where would we spend the money? So if, for example, I've gone from hospital infrastructure on the left here to novel antibiotics, and everybody wants to put their money into wandamycin because wandamycin's going to fix the problem. But the problem is wandamycin will cost, if you're in the US, about $20,000 for a 10-day dose. Well, who can afford that? And we'll come back on to what actually are the cost ceilings in terms of access and appropriate antibiotic therapy. But it's where you put your money is a big problem. So therefore, a lot of attention's gone into creating wandamycin or these new antibiotic combinations. And every time one is released, there's always resistance out there. It's almost intrinsic. The question is, will resistance spread quick enough, going back to Patrick's talk, to actually outrun the new antibiotic, like, for example, cefiderocol or taniborbactam, cefepime, etc. Sort of watch this space. And these are two organizations, and they do a terrific job. CARB-X, which is based fundamentally in Boston. And then on the right-hand side, we have GARP. And GARP is championed, it's a UN organization now, is championed by taking these new drugs and taking them to market. And I'm pleased to say with a bit of a focus on low-income countries, particularly the region in Africa. I just want to spend the next few slides of telling you a little bit about what we do and some of the difficulties that we've experienced. So we have a neonatal program, some of you may know this, called Barnard's. We now have launched Barnard's 2, which is fewer countries, but a much deeper dive into the epidemiology, looking at antibiotic access, looking at antibiotic cost, looking at why antibiotics don't work, and the whole myriad around really about affordability, which is really, really important. So anyway, this is Kanu. This is in northern Nigeria. It's where Boko Haram was. And you can see the labor ward on the bottom here. And the figure on the right, or the picture on the right, is where the mothers, having given birth, are then basically discharged. You have 1 hour to leave after being stitched up and cleaned up. There's no 24 hours or anything like that. This is, a very, very high throughput system. The reason why I'm showing you this is because where we work, we try and do capacity building, and we try and build labs, and we try and put in laboratories to deal with or manage neonatal sepsis. And so this is the building here. This is what it will look like when it will finish. And on the bottom here, we will have, the bottom floor there, we will have an increased NICU or maternity ward. Why is that important? Because this is a state-funded hospital. Why is that important? It's because the mothers can go there, they don't pay anything. If they go up the road, they have to pay £10, 45,000 naira. But here they don't pay. And so therefore, going back to, I was interested in Catherine's talk when she talked about the economics, about rich areas and poor areas and so on. So we have to actually understand why people go to health settings in terms of the economics around this and affordability. However, there is a problem, and the problem is, you can see that the naira, this is the level of the naira to the US dollar, has actually sort of fallen off a cliff, and it's worth about 25% of what it was about a year ago. So therefore, doing anything in these countries is very difficult. But then also, if they import antibiotics from India and China, then all of a sudden they are 4 times more expensive. And you think, well, that's a good thing, but it's not, because we actually don't get the right antibiotics into the right population. This is Dhaka in Bangladesh, and this is DMCH, Dhaka Medical College Hospital. This was the filing room. You can see the filing room. Great bit of filing on the left. It's like my filing in my office, actually. It's like a tectonic shift, that kind of goes on. But we turned it into laboratory and a research lab. And, this cost us something like about £20,000, not much at all. But what happened was, in Bangladesh, you can see that there was this huge fall in the value of the taka. Why was that? Because Sheikh Hasina was forced to leave office. And there was a lot of celebration about that and about she was a tyrant and so on and so forth. But actually now everybody loses out because now you have an unstable economy. The third example of this is in Ethiopia. This is in Dessie in the north. And you can just have a look at the value of the Ethiopian currency as well. So Africa and a lot of these countries are under a lot of increased pressure simply because of inflation and the value of their local currency. And that is in the background of everything else that kind of goes on there. Going back to things like interventions and WASH, water, sanitation and hygiene, it's a huge, huge issue in some of the countries. Hawassa, by the way, is in Ethiopia. It's in the middle of Ethiopia. And this is the labour kind of toilet where the mums go to wash. There is no running water at all in these hospitals. Everything has to be bucketed in. So you can imagine sort of the state. So when we talk about transmission of infections, that's a huge thing. This now is going to the west coast of Africa. This is in Bo in Sierra Leone. Again, this is the labour toilet. And just outside of the hospital, there we are. Just outside of the hospital, in the hospital grounds, there's actually a well where the locals will actually access water, again, because there's no running water. So it's a huge issue. This study, which is an excellent study out of the Lancet series, which unfortunately for I was telling Ramadan, actually, unfortunately for him, as soon as this series came out, Rishi Sunak dissolved Parliament and called an election. So nobody was actually talking about the Lancet series. Everybody was talking about the Tories getting a trashing at the election. So this sort of kind of got lost in the background. But you can have a look at, actually, if you want to try and have a really, really good impact, things like, bang for value, looking at WASH and interventions is a really, really good thing to do in low-income countries. Next few slides. Very quickly, this was a study from Barnard's One, and what we tried to understand was exactly who pays for what, and have a look at the local incomes. And then if you have a look at the bottom row here, just focus on the bottom row because it's a busy slide. Does antibiotic costs influence availability or access? Yes. The only country that said no was South Africa. And so therefore, understanding all of this is really important. Where I showed you that slide in Dessie, in Ethiopia, the hospital only had ceftriaxone to treat neonatal sepsis. It's rubbish. So what happens? The mothers organise themselves, and if there's 6 mothers, for example, with 6 sick babies, on day 1, mother A will go out to the local pharmacy and buy meropenem, and they will share it. On day 2, it will be mother B. On day 3, mother C. And that's how they get around the lack of access within the hospital pharmacy. So one of the fundamental problems we have is that antibiotics are cheap. Amikacin is cheap. It's about $2 a day. But if you want to diagnose sepsis, doesn't matter whether you're in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Rwanda, how much does it cost? It's about $20. So who's going to afford that? Is it going to be the hospital? Is it going to be the government? Is it going to be the patient? And most of the costs are deferred to the patient. There's no chance that they can do that. Which is why diagnostics are not done, which is why antibiotics are essentially used blindly. So you've got no idea what type of bacteria or, what type of drug to treat it with. So the notion of being successful, not successful, is purely based on clinical outcome. So one of the things that we are trying to do is to ask the question, how can we break this cycle? Raising antibiotics, the cost of antibiotics, is not the answer. Because we want the right antibiotics to be accessible. Not the wrong ones, but the right ones. So we've got to try and drive down the cost of the diagnostics. So we've been working with a company in China. Sorry, I'll correct that. We've been working with a group in China that has been working with various companies. So everything is non-biased and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, one of the things what we've done is we've gone out to the countries where we work, like Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and so on, and we simply asked the question, what is the maximum price for a blood culture that they can afford? And you can see the figures there. It raises roughly from $3 to $7. That is where we've got to be. So that is the challenge for future diagnostics. And we think actually that Chinese companies coming into this space will be able to achieve that. This is just my final set of slides. And I mentioned earlier on about the cost of AMR and the spread of it. For those of you in the room who don't know, I've been speaking to a very good friend of mine very recently called Hanran Balki, who is the regional officer for the World Health Organization in the Middle East. And as you can imagine, what's going on in Gaza, so this is Gaza here. Not being biased and trying to be apolitical, this is what's going on in the Ukraine. But wherever you have war, you have a breakdown of infrastructure and therefore lack of sanitation and the spread of AMR. So how much do we actually spend on tackling AMR? Going back to the COVID slide, we roughly on year spend about $1.5 billion US. How much do we spend on arms year in, year out? It's 2.4 trillion at the moment. It's actually, that's an underestimation. It's actually probably more like 3 trillion. So, this doesn't really make any sense if we go back to the figures. By the way, how many people in the last 35 years have died from international conflict? It's about 2 million. Nothing really kind of makes any sense. So these are my conclusions. Post-UN meeting, what will it be remembered for? It's going to be remembered for Donald Trump. Sorry, everyone, but it will be. Nobody's going to be talking about the UN meeting. Nobody's going to be talking about this. It will be Trump beating Harris. That is what 2024 will be remembered for. I think we do need to think about ways in which we engage the public because it's very, very complicated. We definitely need more international engagement that is real and meaningful, that we come on this journey together. And there are obvious links to climate change going back to COP, that's just recently happened, COP29, and environmental degradation. I am now going to shamelessly, speaking of communication, we've made an anime film that was created by teenagers, for teenagers, and we put it on a website called Antibiotic Armageddon. The good news is we've now got funding to put that into UK schools and to translate that into various languages. You notice it's not AMR, it's Antibiotic Armageddon, which hopefully most people can get and understand. And this is just me saying thank you in all the languages across the countries where we work. Thank you very much for your attention.